Hey, everybody. Welcome to Meta Perspective, where we go meta on subjects like insight, awakening, and reality. And today we have a special guest, and that is Brad Warner, the author of Hardcore Zen. Welcome, Brad.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
And you're also the author of actually a ton of books. I'm most familiar with the Hardcore Zen book, but we're going to circle back around to that. So just for people listening, give a short introduction. Who's Brad Warner?
Okay, well, I was let's see. I'm so used to telling the story that I don't know. I can almost do it on autopilot because I've done it so often. But I was I discovered Zen in the early 80s when I was the bass player of a hardcore punk band. And the reason I'd gotten into the whole hardcore punk thing was basically the same reason I got into Zen, which was a kind of a search for something true. And to me, to my mind, because punk rock was trying to tell the truth about what the world was like and what was going on, I felt like Zen was the most punk rock. It was like the idea of punk rock taken to its ultimate level of just not just questioning the government and society, but questioning who am I really? What what is at the basis of society is me, and having to and trying to figure that out. So ended up going to Japan after I had done Zen practice for about 10 years in America, and I went to Japan mainly to just get a job, and ended up working. Well, I worked as an English teacher for a year, and then I worked in a company called Tsuburaya Productions, which is Eiji Tsuburaya was the guy, one of the creators of Godzilla. There's several people involved in the creation of Godzilla, but basically the company he founded did. They didn't have the rights to Godzilla, but they basically did Godzilla type stuff. There was a TV series called Ultraman, which is the Power Rangers are basically an Ultraman ripoff, but Ultraman was a gigantic superhero who fought gigantic monsters, and they're all played by guys in rubber monster costumes and stuff, on miniature sets. And I worked for that company for I think a total of 15 years. But during the time I was working for them in Tokyo, I found a Zen teacher over there named Gudo Nishijima, who had translated this book called Shobogenzo, which is one of the great classics of Zen literature. His was the second full English translation that ever existed, and the first full English translation had been out of print for years by the time my teachers came out. So for a while, his was the only complete translation of the book available. So he was a pretty important guy in that scene, but he was also a very ordinary, sort of humble person. Well, I wouldn't say he's humble, but he was very accessible. And I studied with him, and he decided he wanted to make me a so-called Zen master, in quotes, and a teacher in my own right. That's all that really means. So we did a ceremony, and came back to the U.S. and I wrote a book about Zen called Hardcore Zen, which you talked about, and came back to the United States. Wrote 7 more books about Zen, and I travel around leading Zen retreats and teaching people to meditate. I don't know. That's the short version. How's that?
Yeah. And in some of your videos, and for people listening, you got to check out Brad's YouTube channel. It's awesome. It's a great channel. There's a lot of great videos that you do, and your readings from some of the books, or you're just covering really interesting topics from like a Zen perspective, which I think is really cool. Actually, in some of your videos, you refer to one of your teachers, I think Tim, right? Is that your first teacher?
Yeah. Tim McCarthy is his name. Yeah.
Is he like on the scene? Is he around, or?
He sort of hides himself. He's out there in Ohio, and last I heard, he was still had a little group that he met with. I once asked him if he minded me mentioning him so much, and he's like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Every once in a while, somebody shows up who's because they read one of my books and they show up at one of his retreats or something." But yeah, he's really underground. He's always been, and he's even with the publicity I've given him, he still manages to hide.
Yeah. So we're talking about Zen here. Actually, early on in my journey, if you want to call it that, I was very influenced by a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. So I actually started out kind of in that world with Zen and Chan and stuff. But for people listening, what kind of Zen did you practice in?
Well, it's the Soto school within Zen Buddhism, and it was not started by Dogen, but Dogen is usually the guy who's mentioned as the main popularizer of it. So he was a 13th century in the 1200s. He went over to China. He's a Japanese guy. He was a Japanese guy. Went over to China and studied in this what was in China a very minor form of Zen Buddhism called Soto, and it's their idea in the Rinzai form of Zen Buddhism. I know this all gets confusing to people who aren't familiar with it, but the idea is you do your meditation practice in order to have an experience of enlightenment, satori or kensho or something like that. And Dogen, who started when he was quite young, must have had those experiences. I'm sure he did, but he never felt that they were the final thing. They weren't what he was really looking for. And he discovered this teacher in China who taught a different way, which is that sitting zazen itself is enlightenment, is the direct. So it's not a special experience that you have at the end of the rainbow or the end of the road. It's this ongoing thing. It is your real life in this moment. And he taught a style of zazen called shikantaza, which means just sitting. And the emphasis on the word just, because the Chinese characters that are used to express it, sometimes when people hear just sitting in English, they think it means like just sitting, but it means just sitting. You're trying to do this practice where your seated meditation practice is not about anything else but just sitting still and being fully invested in sitting still, which is which might sound like, oh, I sit still all the time, it's nothing. But if you actually get fully invested in sitting still, there's a lot that you can learn that way. And that's the style that I got involved in.
Yeah, and again, just for people listening, how would you describe Zazen?
Well, Zazen is, I mean, it's a physical practice. So you're actually sitting in a specific way, usually with your legs crossed. Although there are ways to do it if your legs can't handle crossing them in this traditional fashion. But the main thing is you're trying to find a position where your spine is balanced and upright without any support, which is easier to do sitting directly on a cushion than it is on a chair or anything else, because the chair tends to throw your balance off. But so you're doing this kind of, I think it's almost like a balance pose in yoga, but it's a funny balance pose in that you're sitting down. So you're not standing on one leg or something, but you're trying to establish physical balance and trying as much as possible to stay within that physical balance while you sit. And as far as what your mind does, there's no special exercise you're trying to do. You're just trying to kind of concentrate on maintaining this bodily position, if you can even say you're concentrating on anything, and letting all thoughts just kind of pass by. So you don't worry if you're worrying. If you're having one of those days when there's a lot going on in your mind, that doesn't mean you're doing bad zazen practice. You're still doing the zazen practice, but you're trying as much as possible to let that stuff pass and keep your posture centered where it is. So that's what zazen is.
Yeah, and you continue to teach Zazen. Do you teach the Soto version?
Yeah, that's the only one I really know, and that's what I teach. So I just came back. I went for the entire month of September. I was over in Europe doing retreats and things. So yeah. I go around and teach people how to do zazen, basically.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really cool. And you have the book Hardcore Zen, and kind of that kind of label and handle the podcast and the blog.
Mhm.
So what's that come from? The Hardcore Zen.
Yeah, I think that title, I like it and I continue to use it, even though it kind of confuses people. I've had people come after me going, "Hardcore Zen, that's just a macho kind of thing," but it isn't meant to be a description of the kind of Zen I teach. It was actually the title. I had titled my first book, the one that came out as Hardcore Zen. I titled it "Sit Down and Shut Up," which ended up being the title I used for my second book. The publishers didn't think that was a commercial title, and they came up with the title Hardcore Zen based on the fact that I had been in a hardcore punk band and I was now a Zen teacher. So they put the two words together and made it Hardcore Zen, which I really liked, even though I can't take credit for coming up with it. But it's not a description of the basically the type of Zen that I teach is very standard. Sometimes people I mean, sometimes people even complain about that. They expect something, really wild and nutty, but it's really the standard form of zazen that you would get from any sort of teacher in the Soto lineage.
Yeah. So if you're doing a retreat, say just a few days or a week, what does it usually look like?
Well, generally, we get up early in the morning. My teacher had us get up at 4:30, and I usually cut an hour off and make it 5:30. So we get up at 5:30 in the morning. We start sitting, and basically most of the day is dedicated to sitting zazen. So you get up, you sit, then you have breakfast, and then you have a little break, and you sit some more. Then you have another little break, and you sit some more. It's basically a lot of sitting, and the version we do is you sit facing a wall. The Rinzai style of Zen, you sit facing away from the wall. So that's if you ever walk into a temple, you can figure out which one it is if you see people sitting. Um, and basically, we're just sitting and staring at a wall all day. I do one or two lectures a day, depending on how many days the retreat are, and I will also offer what's called dokusan, which means you can come in if you want to sign up and come in and talk to me for a few minutes one on one. I'll do that as well, and that's pretty much it. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty standard.
Um, do you have like I guess when you're doing a retreat, you teach like the main principles of Zen, or at least your style of Zen?
Yeah, I usually pick some text or something that strikes me as interesting, or I think people would like, and sort of read it and talk about it. I don't. I was actually, when I was doing because I do this YouTube channel that you mentioned, and as I was doing my one yesterday, I was thinking, yeah, this isn't too different from what I do when I do a lecture, except they're shorter. I try to keep the YouTube videos under 20 minutes, and the lectures I do on a retreat are normally an hour. So it's like if you ever saw my YouTube channel, it's sort of like a longer version of that. I just pick out some text or something and talk about it, and then I take questions from the audience, which is to me the most interesting part. Sometimes I feel like the initial part of me talking about something is just to warm the audience up to feel comfortable talking to me, because that's where I find out what they are interested in and where they're at. So if I don't know where the audience is at, I don't know what to teach them. So.
Yeah. And for people listening, what are some of the fundamental principles of Zen?
That's always a hard question to answer, because it's so difficult. I mean, one of the fundamental principles is, well, I wrote a book called "There Is No God and He Is Always With You," which is a quote from a Zen teacher in the Rinzai lineage. But I like that quote. And a lot of people will talk about Buddhism, of which Zen is a branch of Buddhism, as a religion with no God. And I thought, well, that's not entirely incorrect, but I think it would also be just as correct to say there is a God in Buddhism, which is, I guess this is one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism right there, is contradiction. uh, rather than reject contradiction, one of the things the Zen form of Buddhism does is just embrace contradictions. Which is why a lot of Zen philosophy sounds screwy to people, because it'll say, it'll just say one thing and then say the opposite. Like there is no God and He is always with you. I thought was a good short version of how to encapsulate the Zen view of God. It's more of a question than a statement. So there isn't really a belief system attached to it. I mean, you could argue that among Zen Buddhists there are certain common beliefs, but there is no idea that you must believe XYZ in order to be a Zen Buddhist. You could believe whatever you want. It doesn't really matter that much. If you want to believe that Jesus Christ is God's only begotten Son, or if you want to believe that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah or whatever, you can do that. From the Zen side of things, there's no argument. Maybe from the other religion side, there might be an
Yeah.
argument, but from the Zen side, it doesn't matter. So that's also part of it. Some people argue that it's more of a philosophy than a religion. I don't think it's a religion, but I don't think it's a philosophy either. I think the categories of philosophy and religion are particular to Western thought. So you had this whole stream, because the world was for centuries almost divided into two halves of humanity, Eastern and Western. Now they've kind of come together. And you had that stream going on in the other side of the world where they didn't ever feel the need to make a distinction between philosophy and religion. So Zen Buddhism is in a lot of ways more like a philosophy in the Western sense, but there are practices to it that almost seem religious. There are ceremonies and there are chants and there are things that you do as part of it, because we recognize that these things are a way of embodying the philosophy. So the philosophy isn't just something you hold in your head; it's something you enact. And the ceremonies and things that make it look like a religion are there as ways to embody the philosophy. And you could conceivably replace those ceremonies with other ceremonies, but nobody's really done a good job of that yet. And that's why, for my part, I just stick with the traditional ceremonies of, the old ones that they've been doing for hundreds of years in the rest of the world in Asia. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that a good answer?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. And for people interested in Zen,
Mhm.
they're just hearing about it. Where's a good place to start for people that are interested?
Well, you mentioned Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki, and that is that was the book that got me started. Well, actually, I more got started because of the teacher who I took a class at Kent State University called Zen Buddhism, which I kind of signed up for on a whim. Not really a whim. I really wanted to know something about Eastern philosophy, but the only course on offer about Eastern philosophy at that time at Kent State University in Ohio was one called Zen Buddhism. So I ended up with that one. But anyway, that was the book that Tim McCarthy, my first teacher, taught out of. So I like that one. I feel weird recommending my own books, but I wouldn't keep writing them if I didn't think they were good. So I do think they're good.
Yeah.
So Hardcore Zen is my first book, and that's the one most people start with. And my most recent book is called Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. And part of the reason I wrote that book is because I thought I had a chance to possibly revise Hardcore Zen when they decided to do like an anniversary, like a 10th anniversary, or was it 15th? Maybe it's almost the 20th. Anyway, maybe it was 15th anniversary reprint of it, but I decided it wasn't. I don't want to revise it because I always hated what George Lucas did to Star Wars. It ruined it. And I didn't
Yeah.
ruin my book for people, but I also
Yeah.
there was a lot of things I would say differently. So Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen is sort of meant as a kind of a companion to Hardcore Zen, in the sense that it's also a book which tries to introduce it to a person who has no idea what it is. And that the theme of that book was a friend of mine who I'd known since the old punk rock days. He got cancer and died, and we'd been really close. And I realized that in all the years that we'd been close, I'd never talked to him about Zen. You know, it was just not. This was just not the thing that isn't the. You know, we met over punk rock. You know, we didn't meet over Zen Buddhism. And you know, living in the same small town in Ohio was our other thing we had in common. Uh, and and I regretted not ever talking to him about it, because I thought maybe it could have helped him. You know, he died in his 40s, so you know, quite young to die, and it might have helped him through that process to know a little bit about that stuff. So the book, it was sort of an idea to redress that and address that problem, and then you know, kind of writing a series of letters to him that I'm sharing with the audience about Zen Buddhism. So him being a representative of a person who knew nothing about Zen, who had no concept of what it was or why somebody like me would be involved in it. You know, somebody he knew as the bass player for Zero Defects would be involved in Zen.
Yeah.
You know, why? So
Yeah.
yeah. So I think those are, you know, among my books, those are good places to start. Uh, yeah, and you can also just look in Google and see if there's a local center in your area, and check them out. Some places are better than others. I'll just say it that way. But you might luck out and find one of the good ones. And that would be.
What in your opinion, what makes a good one from a not so great one?
Um, I think most of the places that are operating these days are basically good. The ones that go wrong are when sometimes the teacher gets a bit arrogant and full of, I'll say himself, because it's usually not the female teachers that go this way, but you know, they get full of themselves and they become a bit culty. Um, you get a lot of that, but I think a center where you feel that the people are sincerely working towards something. The idea of a teacher in Zen is that the teacher and the student are both working towards the same thing, which is beyond both of them, but the teacher has a bit of, I hate to even use the word authority, but I suppose you have to use the word authority, a bit of authority based on a prior experience with it, and being more deeply settled into it. So there is a little bit of a hierarchy, but it shouldn't be too much of yeah. One of the things Zen is famous for is this is another one of those contradictions, is being almost obsessed with hierarchy, but also kind of having this idea that the hierarchy is just a framework which allows us to practice.
Yeah.
So you know, finding teachers who understand that is, to me, that's one of the trickiest aspects. And I don't want to bore the audience by going on too far, but I have trouble with that, because I don't see myself as an authority figure, so I don't know how to take that role of the teacher properly. I don't think. I think I do a bad job of that. Um, but but that's, you know, part of how you handle the practice and the teaching of it. I don't know what I
Yeah,
just.
no, well, and you know what? The thing is, you know, different teachers and different styles of teaching are going to appeal to different people. And I could definitely see where your style would be very appealing, especially, I mean, as a Westerner, you know, for me, and you know, you kind of, right, lived in the East, but you're from the West. The way that Westerners look at hierarchy is, especially in the 21st century, is not as like, I don't know. I'm a millennial, so when I see a hierarchy, I'm just like, yeah, this is just, you know, this is just whatever, you
Yeah,
know.
that is a kind of a problem, and it's a difficult one. I think it's not just generational; it's also very American, because you know, the United States was kind of this country that was founded on rejecting authority. You know, so it goes back to the founding of this country. And in a lot of ways, it's what's made America successful in things like business and stuff like that, was this rejection of authority, and rejection of tradition, because we became this very innovative nation. And there's something important about that, and there's something valuable about that. But we have also, in embracing that maybe too much, we've lost the ability often to learn from others. I
Yeah.
see this in myself. I had to kind of, when I lived in Japan, I had to learn uh, to deal with they have a very strong sense of tradition and hierarchy, and it was really difficult for me to deal with that. But once I got into it, I realized, oh, you can learn this way because you become more accepting of an older person's experience, for example. Um, and not just going, old man, I'm going to do it the new way. uh,
Yeah.
which like I say, there's value to that, but we as Americans have kind of placed maybe too much emphasis on that, and we want to break everything down before we even understand it, and that's kind of a problem, I think.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I wanted to talk about Satori and Kensho. So are Satori and Kensho the same thing, or are there nuances?
Well, I suppose there are nuances in the way they're used. Kensho means literally seeing the true nature. It just means see nature, but it means seeing the true nature of things. It's sort of shortened. And satori is satoru is actually a Japanese verb that's used to mean to comprehend or understand something. But when you use it in the Zen term, it means the sort of ultimate understanding. But it's usually understood or usually described as a moment when things all come together, and there's this great awakening experience. And experiences like that do happen. The problem is it's also very easy to get stuck in those experiences, and after a while, the best analogy I always come up with for this is it becomes like the guy who won the football game in his senior year of high school, and 30 years later he's like over beers going, yeah, the great touchdown, glug glug glug. Sometimes those satori or kensho experiences become kind of the spiritual version of that. So even though the experiences really do happen and they can be important and transformative, it's also important to be able to let go of those experiences. So my teacher he didn't like words like satori and kensho. So the words Nishijima Roshi used were solving philosophical problems. That's what he would call it. Oh, you're
Yeah.
the experience of solving philosophical problems. And I go, okay, yeah, I can see why you'd say it that way.
And is just in the definition, I'm not sure. Are you familiar with Vipassana?
Yeah, I know what it is and a little bit about it, but I've never practiced in Vipassana. So
The only reason I'm asking is I'm asking, do you know if there's a correlation? Because like Satori Kensho, um, the terminology sounds similar to Vipassana as far as the definition. I think like the definition of Vipassana is something like seeing clearly.
yeah,
It's along
insight.
those lines.
Yeah, sometimes they use the word insight.
Yeah, and yeah, yeah,
It is like that. And my teacher used to say that sitting zazen is enlightenment itself, but he also would say, if you pressed him on it, he'd say, yes, there's that, and there's also something he would call second enlightenment. So the first enlightenment is just doing the practice, and the second enlightenment is that experience of solving philosophical problems. So there if you do this practice for long enough, most people will have at least one moment of like almost blinding clarity. And it can, I wrote about it. I wrote about my little moment of blinding clarity in Hardcore Zen. And then I wrote about it again in that other book I mentioned, There Is No God and He Is Always With You. Um, it was a moment in which after that I could never conceive of the world the same way again, because it was so transformative, and it became clear to me that what I thought I understood about who I was and the world I was living in was completely wrong, like just so completely wrong that there wasn't any real connection between the truth and what I had learned was the truth all my life. Uh, but then again, you kind of uh, something I wrote about recently on my blog is this idea of you always end up back here, which is the only way I know how to put it. But you always end up back here. It's you have that experience of blinding clarity, and then after that, you're like, I'm back here where I was before. Uh, Whereas, you might expect that you'd go off somewhere else and you'd be this totally transformed person, but that isn't what happens. You're kind of back in the same um, boat that you were in before, but you're seeing it very differently, and that does make a difference. But you still have all the same, neuroses and fears and wants and whatever else. Those don't suddenly go away, and you don't suddenly become a morally perfect person or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just you can kind of see things differently, and when those neuroses and fears and desires and things come up, um, you end up with a little bit of a choice. You're like, well, I could give in to that, but I could also understand that that's just something my brain is doing. It's just going,
Yeah.
and going, you got to have that thing. And you can go, yeah, I could go get that thing, or I could just ignore that voice that says, you got to have that thing. Um,
Yeah.
so that's
Are
different.
you are you familiar with the terminology of stream entry?
No, I haven't heard that.
Okay. So yeah, that's it's very interesting, and it kind of is very related to what you're discussing, Satori, Kensho. Um, and so stream entry in the Theravadan
Dream
Buddhist.
entry. Okay, yeah, I misheard you. Yeah, I have heard
Oh,
that, but keep going.
yeah, it's the first kind of like major level of awakening of
Yeah,
the four major awakenings, which the first one is the stream entry, and it's kind of like the point of it's the first. Well, people can argue that there's subsets of that, like the arising and passing, which is the first time you're kind of like transformed and you're like in the thing. But the stream entry is what's looked at as that you're in the stream of awakening now and there's no going back.
yeah,
And it sounds similar to what you're saying, because again, once you're in the stream, you're in it. You can't
yeah,
look, you can't unsee what you've seen.
yeah,
you
yeah.
know
That's kind of it. Yeah, once you kind of know, once you kind of seen beyond the veil or whatever it is, even if the veil comes back and covers you up again, you're like, I know that's just a veil, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So is there like a final Satori or a final Kensho?
I really don't know. In Buddhist terms, there's this the idea of parinirvana, but parinirvana is also a synonym for death. So there is so it's the ultimate nirvana is just dying. But you know, yes, I would think there is, but it gets a bit tricky to say because at this moment, the final awakening is already there. It's just that we're not noticing it. And
Yeah.
the fact that we don't notice it is a real thing, and can be a problem. And it's something that we address, but uh, it's also kind of an illusion itself. So there is so there is, I imagine, a kind of final awakening, but I don't know. There's this idea of the in Theravada Buddhism, the non-returner, somebody who well, it gets into the idea of reincarnation and all that, which I tend to have a slightly wonky view on, but but the idea of somebody who never returns to this world, because is the idea, if you accept reincarnation, the idea is you keep reincarnating as long as you keep getting it wrong, and at some point, once you get it right, you don't reincarnate anymore. But at the same time, I don't think there is no you. So
Yeah.
the problem with reincarnation, and the argument I always have with it, is it assumes a person who reincarnates. And if you let go of that idea of there being any person who can reincarnate, then there isn't a reincarnation. Although I think maybe in conventional terms you could speak of it that way, um, which is why whenever people press me on that question, I go, yeah, I sort of believe in it, but I sort of don't.
Yeah. Oh, and maybe that's the realization, right? If there's no one to return, how could you return anyways?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's like a, almost again, like you said, one of those contradictions that is just embraced in the Zen way.
Yeah.
Um, but it's funny, what you mentioned, the kind of final awakening always being there. And if you look at like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that kind of version of yoga,
Mhm.
the entire idea is that the awakening, so to speak, is already there, but your practice is removing the obstructions from what is innately there.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea. And everything is a metaphor. So you kind of have to take any of these metaphors, even the good ones, you have to kind of take with a grain of salt. But yeah, it is like removing the obstructions. It's the blinders that you have. But then again, probably somebody like Dogen would say that the blinders are also part of your enlightenment. So that's where you get. That's where it all makes you crazy if you study this stuff too much.
Yeah, yeah. I know exactly, because you can get into the kind of, I don't know, contemplation of those kind of things, but again, that's almost like an exercise in some ways. And um, but you do have realizations when contemplating things like that too.
Yeah.
Uh, would you, getting back to the Vipassana aspect of it, it's often considered like insight meditation or insight practice. Would you consider like Zazen a type of insight meditation?
Well, you could, but it doesn't emphasize. It doesn't. Excuse me. It doesn't emphasize insight as being the goal of the practice. So
Yeah,
you're not doing the practice in order to have insights. But if you do the practice, insights are going to happen. And that, I think that's kind of the special character of the Zen tradition, is is the idea that we admit that there is something called insight or enlightenment, or something like that, but we also don't emphasize it that strongly as a goal, because that actually ironically stands in your way. So if you have any idea about insight, usually that the idea will drive you to start comparing, here's my experience now and here's what I think insight would be like, and oh, I'm not having that, so I'm not doing it right, so I got to push on and get the insight. And the Zen practice is encouraging you to let all of that go, which is easier said than done, and just understand the insight that you're already having. you know here
yeah,
here is my moment of insight, here's my moment of Zen. Let me just experience it clearly, or even if I'm not experiencing it clearly, let me be fully involved in the experience of not having clarity about it. That's what
yeah,
weird.
yeah. No, because I know a lot of, there's different schools of Vipassana or insight meditation, but I think, a lot of the practices um, you're trying to see reality as it is.
Mhm.
And the practice for that is literally just observing the senses,
Yeah.
basically, right? Anything that comes into your awareness, you watch it arise and pass. And that's pretty much the whole practice. So, but they say, you refine that ability to see things as they are. And that's, I guess, why they call it insight. Um, but yeah, you actually, you talk about Dogen a lot. And
Yeah.
I love the stuff that you talk about on your channel. You read like these small passages. Is a lot of that your exposure and influence of Dogen from the translation that your teacher did of the work?
Yeah, yeah. My first teacher, he never translated Dogen, but he would read from that, what I mentioned, that older translation of Dogen, fairly frequently. So I was familiar with Dogen before I met Nishijima Roshi. But him being such a, I mean, he made his name translating Dogen into English, so he was really steeped in it. And there's kind of a sense of, I think, if you're if you are lucky enough to find a teacher of a certain tradition or a certain path, the best thing you can do is just follow that and see where that leads you. And then later on, if you want to go into the side roads and look at what else is out there, I think that can also be useful. But I decided that since Nishijima Roshi was my teacher and that he was, completely sold on Dogen, I'm just going to go deep dive into Dogen. This is also kind of a Japanese thing. If you know anything about Japanese culture, one of the things about it is there are all these people who are super nerds on one, particular aspect of pop culture. For example, there'll be the superest. I met so many Ultraman super nerds when I was over there, and I guess I'm sort of one of them, but not nearly to the level of some of these people I met. So the same thing with Zen. I just went super nerdy with Dogen, and in a sense, there are a lot of other paths out there, but I think anybody who wants to follow one of those would be best served by just following that one, and not getting too sidetracked. That's one of the problems I see kind of in American approaches to Eastern spirituality is, and I'm guilty of this myself. You just want to know it all. You want to know all the different versions of it, and some people never settle on one thing. So what I do is I try to learn as much as I can about the other stuff, but only practice the one thing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just for people listening too, what was the name of that book, the Dogen book translation by your teacher?
Oh, Shobo Genzo. So it means treasury of the true Dharma eye, and yeah, that was Dogen's masterwork, which he wrote in the 1200s. Um, and yeah, I wrote two books. One was called Don't Be a Jerk, and the other was called It Came from Beyond Zen. And actually, Sit Down and Shut Up with It, which I mentioned. So three books that really just go into as much detail as I think an average reader can handle about Dogen. I don't try to. I tried to approach it in a non-scholarly way, because most of the books I've seen about Dogen, I actually enjoy them, but I can understand why regular people would just be totally turned off by them, because it's a lot of scholarly jargon and a lot of, stuff that really only interests people who are deeply, deeply nerdy about it. And I thought it was important to try to present Dogen in a way that was a bit more accessible and didn't burden the reader with too much specialized jargon and stuff, and had a few jokes in it to try to lighten the mood sometimes. So that was the point of those three books.
Yeah, we kind of touched on this a little, but what's like the Zen view of enlightenment?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, if you're talking about Soto, their view is that you can talk about an experience like Satori or Kensho if you want, but the real enlightenment is this moment right here and now is your enlightenment. But there's also another side to it that is accessible if you could become very, very quiet in your mind. You can start to notice things a little bit more clearly. But there isn't a, like I said earlier, that moment that transforms everything. On the one hand, yes, there are sometimes moments that transform everything, but you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that you've figured it all out once you've had one of those moments, which is the pitfall almost everybody gets into. I've gotten into it. Every teacher I've known has had the experience of falling into that rabbit hole, and some people never get out of it, and that can be an issue.
And in your practice or school of Zen, is there the Zen koan or no?
Well, it's approached differently. So yeah, there is. Dogen actually talks about koans all the time. there almost the entire Shogo Genzo is commentaries on different koans, which are these old teaching stories. But then there's the other way of using koans, which is characteristic of Rinzai style Zen, in which a student is given a koan to solve, in quotes. So you're supposed to present your answer to the koan to your teacher, or your present your understanding of the koan to your teacher. And typically in the Soto school, we don't do that kind of thing. It's more that you present the koan as a talking point and something to maybe contemplate the meaning of, but you're not trying to demonstrate it to your teacher that you've figured it out. That's not really our practice.
Are those the two schools you mentioned? Are those the main schools of Zen, or are there others too?
Yeah, there's basically Rinzai and Soto, and then there's another school called Obaku, which still exists in a very few temples in Japan. Uh, I think all three came from China originally, and I don't know what the situation is in China anymore, especially after the Cultural Revolution and everything else that happened over there. So a lot of the Chinese Zen exists really only in Japan anymore, or Korea, and now in America and Europe too, but very little really exists in China anymore. But yeah, those are the two main schools, and probably in Japan the Soto style is, there are more Soto temples than Rinzai temples, which is kind of the opposite of what had been the case in China. In China, the Rinzai school was dominant, and then they both came to Japan, and somehow in Japan, the Soto school, which had been a minority school in China, became the bigger one, and the Rinzai is, although it still exists, is the smaller one.
And is Zen and Chan identical?
Yeah, they're just different word. There's a Chinese character that is pronounced Chan in Chinese, and Zen in Japanese, and it represents a Sanskrit word dhyana, which is just, it was just a character they created to represent this Indian word, which dhyana is usually translated as meditation, but also you can pronounce it jhana, or which in which case it tends to refer to something a bit more special than just meditation, like
Concentration.
yeah, yeah, and Dogen actually hated the word Zen was in use in his time 800 years ago, but he didn't like it, and he said that his what he taught was not Zen. Um, and my teacher actually followed that because he was such a Dogen nerd that he didn't like calling it Zen either. But I realized once I got back to America and I was teaching it, you can't avoid that word, because you have to describe it in ways that people can understand. But Dogen thought there should be one Buddhism, and that the only true Buddhism was Zen Buddhism. Of course, we have this attitude in the US where if you say something like that, you sound like a bigot or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't say it that way, but the tradition is to express it that way. So yeah, it is the same. It is the Chan and Zen is the same thing basically.
Yeah, and the so he said what he's teaching is not Zen. Did he say what he is teaching? Did he then go follow up with that?
Well, he would say it was only Buddhism. The word Bukkyo is the Japanese word, and Bukkyo means the teachings of Buddha. So when we say the word, this is another problem of concepts East and West, because we have a Western concept, Buddhism, and actually if you look into it, although these days most people in Asia also have adopted that way of looking at it, up until maybe the 19th century, nobody in Asia looked at it that way. There was the teachings of Buddha, um, and it wasn't exactly a religion. This is what I was kind of talking about a few minutes ago, uh, and that's what Dogen said that he taught, was Bukkyo, the teachings of Buddha. And the argument is that the real thing that the historical Buddha taught was this meditation practice, and that's what we should be focused on. And that there is a single stream of correct understanding of this. This is where, you get into arguments, because people will say, well, no, this is the correct stream of understanding, and people argue about that stuff. But there's this idea of a lineage, an unbroken lineage of teachers who got it right. And yeah, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, I had like early on, many years ago, I practiced Chinese martial arts just for a short period of time, and that's how I got introduced to Chan.
Hmm.
And again, yeah, they use the name Bodhidharma, which I've heard you use, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that from, because they have the Shaolin have their interpretation of how the Buddha came to be,
Yeah.
and they call him the Bodhidharma, and
Well,
so
Bodhidharma was supposedly the guy who brought the Zen stream of Buddhism to China, but he also established a temple called the Shaolin Temple, and they were the ones who basically created the martial arts. I don't think Bodhidharma is usually thought of as being involved in that, but it was something that came about as a development of that temple, and how they were going to deal with the real world problems of having to defend themselves. So they had this idea of um, ethics and morality and not harming anyone, but they also didn't want all their stuff to get stolen and their temples to get ransacked by bandits and bad guys. So this is the story that's told, at least in Zen. The martial arts were developed as a way to keep the Buddhist teachings of ethics while also being able to defend yourself in a practical way if you were attacked or something. That's the way.
yeah. There's an excellent book I would recommend, and again, I guess this is just one perspective of it, but it's called the Shaolin Grandmaster Text,
Mm.
and a super cool book if you're interested in martial arts and or Zen and Chan. And they also explain how they're in the Shaolin, it's the Zen and Chan, but there's a tint of Taoism,
Yeah,
and that's why they have the Qigong and Tai Chi
yeah,
and mixed in there with it. So there, it's really I thought it was really cool, and it vibed with me because I like the physical aspect of it. So Qigong and Tai Chi are things I appreciate.
yeah,
Um, but I want to shift gears here a little. You have a really awesome YouTube channel, and you get into a whole bunch of cool topics. And for people listening to this, I might know I have another channel called Engaging the Phenomenon, which deals primarily with UFOs. Um, so you recently made a video on Jacques Vallée and UFOs.
yeah.
So you're somebody who's a Zen master teacher who's familiar with UFOs. So
Yeah.
what's your view on UFOs in general? Let's start there.
It's always a dangerous topic because, well, as you know, if you studied it, it's easy to get. There's the sense of Jacques Vallée talks about it in his book. If you study these things, there's a real prejudice against it. That's crazy stuff. That's paranormal and all that. I think there must be something to the phenomenon, and it's something I was interested in as a kid, long before I got interested in Zen. I loved all the science fiction movies and stuff, and it got me into studying UFO books. I remember being a teenager and reading a bunch of those, whatever I could find about UFOs, and getting really interested in it. And I've maintained that interest. I think there is something out there, and obviously, if you consider the size of the physical universe, there's got to be some other forms of intelligence. This can't have happened just once. uh, I think most people who think about the topic would agree with that. The disagreement comes in whether whatever is out there would be able to would have any interest in, or would be even able to communicate with us. It might be that whoever's out there would be so far away, and maybe it's such a rare phenomena to develop intelligence like we have, that we would never come in contact. This probably wouldn't really phase the Buddhists that much, because if you look at Buddhist cosmology and mythology, there is a place for aliens in it. They even did a couple of episodes of Ancient Aliens, the TV show, about the if you look at the Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, there are ways to interpret them that sound like UFO encounters. There's plenty of stuff in there, and in even traditional Buddhist literature beyond the Ancient Aliens interpretation of it, would say that there are beings who exist in higher realms, and whether higher could be physically higher, like up in the sky, like in outer space, or conceptually higher, like another sort of dimension beyond us. um, you could argue what it means, but there is a place for that. And I personally haven't encountered any of these higher intelligences, but I have no trouble believing that people have, and that it's possible. The other thing, though, about Buddhism, which is interesting in that aspect, is they always say that the human beings are the high are even though they talk about higher realms, the human beings are in the best realm, which is to say that the higher realms are actually not as good for awakening in the Buddhist sense, because everything is too good there. So if you could imagine a society that's a million years advanced from human society, where you could basically fulfill all your desires, with a touch of a button or something like that. Somebody who lived in a society like that would have very little interest in spiritual practice, and so it's considered to be better to be born in the human realm. So maybe if we meet the aliens, we'll end up teaching them. Maybe the aliens are coming to learn from us. That's one of my theories.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating perspective on that. I think it's unique, and again, there's a lot to be said of that. If you're able to have anything you want whenever you want it, or have all these advanced technologies, you may not even have the inclination to try to so-called awaken.
Yeah.
Um, so I understand that. And what did you notice when, like, the whole December 2017 Tic Tac and the big ATIP story broke?
Oh yeah, yeah. I was watching that with great interest, and that I actually was working. We talked about this before we started the podcast. I was working on a book about that subject, sort of a Zen approach to UFOs, and I may still I play around with that book every couple of weeks, and see if I can get anywhere with it. But I'd been working on that, and when that stuff broke, I thought, oh, that's interesting, because finally the idea of the official story, the government story, changing to the point where they're admitting, yeah, there is something to all of this. I think that's a huge shift, because as Jacques Vallée points out in his book, one of the problems with studying any of this, and I mentioned it just a minute ago, is that you immediately sound like an idiot to a lot of people. But I think there's good reason to think that there is something out there, uh, some sort of other intelligence that it seems to be interacting with human beings in a way that's very strange. High
Yeah,
strangeness, I guess, is the term that
yeah,
that's
yeah,
sometimes used. Yeah, and that's kind of beyond our normal way of understanding things.
yeah. And now you have, again, like you said, the United States government is doing a 180 on this and saying, yeah, it looks like there's something real about this. So the stigma is dissolving as we know it, and now it's not the idea of it being a weird, strange thing to look at is dissipating.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might be like a generational thing. I mean, you've got so many people who've grown up on Star Trek, and Star Wars is not exactly.
ET.
Yeah, yeah, ET and all that stuff. So we've seen it, we're familiar with it, and people are sort of inclined to believe it. Belief is one of the things. I mean, belief is one of the things, as a Buddhist, we get into this idea of what is the utility and meaning of belief. And so so a lot depends on what human beings are willing to believe is true, or willing to believe is at least possible, and that will shift our way of dealing with any specific phenomenon. So I think it's good. When I get into UFOs, though, I started getting really attracted to the weirdest stories, because I think that's something Jacques Vallée points out, that he talks about how these stories are so absurd. My favorite absurd UFO
Yeah.
story, which you
Yeah.
probably know about, is the guy in Wisconsin who the aliens came down and gave him pancakes. Do you know this
Yeah.
story?
Yeah.
In, I think, 1960. Um, and it's such a bizarre story. Basically, this UFO comes and descends on this guy's house, and he's like a chicken farmer. He's like, not very educated, and the aliens come out and they give him three pancakes and then go away. And then he goes and tries to get the FBI to look at his pancakes, and they go, well, these are just ordinary pancakes, and they think he's a screwball, but he never recanted his story. And I think something really did happen to that guy. And I think somebody, I don't know who, really did give him pancakes. He had a very strange encounter. But that's just, that's part of the absurdity of it. Vallée points out that maybe part of the operating, of this, of whatever this intelligence is that they do things that are deliberately absurd for reasons that don't make any sense at all to us, but may make sense in some way to whatever they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
now
He
I'm
often,
screwed.
yeah, no, a lot of times he talks about the almost like social impact to affect the subconscious of the collective
Yeah.
population, and he's referred to it sometimes as a thermostat of human consciousness on one level. So there's a lot of interpretations, and then again, you have cases where there's just physical, alleged physical, like the Roswell, right?
Yeah.
So there's a consciousness aspect, but there's also the physical aspect where you have the ATIP thing going on, and they have the videos of some of these objects with radar tracking and stuff. But again, it's just one of those things. It's like just beyond our understanding, it seems. But I
Yeah.
don't know. It looks like we're entering a time where at least we'll perceivably understand it better.
Mhm.
Um, but again, I really appreciate you as a Zen dude talking about that openly on your channel. I really respect that. Um, do you speak to other like Zen teachers or anything about it, or does it ever come up?
No, I can't. I was trying to think. I did. Uh, there was one guy. God, who was it? Um, I haven't talked to him for a while, but he was a student of my first teacher's teacher, and he's the only other Zen teacher. I can't even come up with his name right now, but he's the only other Zen teacher I've ever met, and I didn't even meet him in person. We kind of had some Skype conversations or something about 5 years ago. Um, he's the only other Zen teacher I encountered who was into that stuff. Um, most Zen teachers, they're just like most people. They kind of go, oh yeah, whatever. This is goofy science fiction stuff, and maybe in a sense it is, but there's something beyond that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I recently had Vince Valkyrie Horn on, and Daniel Ingram, and they were pretty open about the idea. And Vince Horn was like, yeah, how come no Buddhist teachers are talking about this? It's like right out in the public and in the open now. It's not even like, it's on the news like regularly. And I don't know if you saw, but the chief of NASA was recently saying, yeah, UFOs are real. I received an official briefing, a classified briefing on the Armed Service Committee. So, and they said, oh, well, what do you think it is? You think it's drones or something? And he's like, and he's inferring that it's probably some other intelligence, basically. So that's when you have the chief of NASA, the
Yeah,
current chief of NASA, making those kind of statements,
it is
you know,
interesting. I can see why there's a lot at stake. I mean, my own take on government secrecy about it is probably has more to do with the government and military. They don't know what it is.
right.
It's,
Right.
you know, I
Yeah.
mean, there's all the people who believe, oh, we got secret treaties with the aliens and such. I think that's highly unlikely. I think the problem is that the military doesn't know what it is, and if they would admit that there's something powerful out there that they don't know what it is, well, that's going to erode confidence in the military. Like, oh, you mean there's beings out there that could, you know, take over our planet, and you don't know what to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's been great talking with you, Brad. You're such a cool dude. I love your work. I love your channel. I suggest everybody go check your work out. And where could everybody find your work?
Well, the YouTube channel is just youtube.com/hardcore zen. So I do new video every 3 times a week. I have a podcast, which is the Hardcore Zen podcast, and it's on all the main. I find it on Spotify, but it's on all the podcast platforms. And then I have a blog, which is hardcorezen.info. And if you go there, it has what do you call that? Links to everything else. So that's a good place. So hardcorezen.info has links to the YouTube channel and the podcast and everything else.
Yeah. And yeah, you have all the Godzilla stuff. I'm like a Dragon Ball nerd. So I
Oh,
love Dragon Ball Z and all that stuff. Today is like one of the only days I'm not wearing a Dragon Ball Z shirt.
oh,
um, but again, I greatly appreciate your time. I appreciate your work and what you do. Do you have any kind of like parting words to the audience? Anything?
no,
Anything?
I can't think of anything. I mean, what I say at the end of my YouTube videos is have a good time all the time, which is
I love that though. That's really cool.
comes from Spinal Tap. I think it's the last line in the movie. This is Spinal Tap. Somebody says, "What's your philosophy?" What to I think the keyboard player, and he says, "Have a good time all the time."
Yeah.
I just love that.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate your time, and everybody go check out Brad's stuff. And I hope to speak to you again soon, Brad.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care.